I would like to thank you for joining us today for the next installment in our virtual education series. I also especially want to thank our guest speaker today, Worshipful Michael Paul. Brother Paul is the owner of Cornerstone Book Publishers and editor of the Journal of the Masonic Society. He is a fellow of and past president of the Masonic Society, a fellow of the Philalethes Society, a fellow of the Maine Lodge of Research, member of the Society of Blue Friars, secretary of the Louisiana Lodge of Research, and full member of the Texas Lodge of Research. A New York Times best-selling writer and publisher, he is a prolific writer, editor, and publisher of Masonic and esoteric books. He is also the host of the YouTube channel, New Orleans Scottish Rite College. As time permits, he travels and speaks on the history of Freemasonry, with a particular focus on the early history of the Scottish Rite, lodge leadership, and rebuilding weak lodges. Now I'll turn the time over to our good brother for his talk, The Early Oklahoma and Louisiana Masonic Scottish Rite Connection. Worshipful Brother Paul, are you ready?
I'm ready. I spoke with a friend of mine about a week or so ago, and he had saw the advertising promotion for this lecture, and he wanted to know what in the world was wrong with me. What was I thinking? He says, you know full well, he says that there's no direct connection between the history of Oklahoma Masonry and Louisiana Masonry. He says there's only a slim little thing if you talk about the Louisiana Purchase. And I realized that I was probably being a little too vague with what I was doing. And I was trying to allude to something a little deeper. And, you know, we live in a really difficult time now. We're divided. It's a divided country, a divided world. And I was trying to make the point of connections and how we can somehow get away from them and be us. And connections is the best way. I know that, you know, we look at other people and we say, well, this guy's a little different, so maybe that's not good. And the point is that if I like strawberry ice cream and the other guy likes Rocky Road, that doesn't in itself make any moral definition for either one of us. It's just a preference. And this has to do with a lot of the history of Masonry and what we sometimes see as a problem, and it's simply a difference. I certainly can't come here as a Louisiana Masonic historian and try to speak with any clear or professed knowledge of all the details of Oklahoma Masonry. I know the Grand Lodge of Oklahoma was 1892 was created. It was created from an earlier, the Grand Lodge of the Indian Nation, Indian Territory, 1870. I've forgotten the date now, but I know it came from an earlier lodge, 1874. It came from an earlier lodge from 1855 was the oldest lodge that I read about. And that year is certainly important in Louisiana Masonry. But what I wanted to do was go back and take a little look at some of the early times in Louisiana Masonry and some of the difficult early times, and try to apply that to other people and try to see if we can learn something about how we can sometimes not judge from the outside and look more towards the inside and realize that being different in itself is not always the problem. Now, the earliest record that we have of Louisiana Masonry is a lodge that was created in New Orleans in 1752. It was Perfect Harmony Lodge. Now, this was created Louisiana and mainly New Orleans, because New Orleans was the shipping port and center, and that was really the jewel for that area, because it goods and transportation would come down from the Mississippi River. But this lodge was created, and it was French in nature, French in language, French in ritual. Now, we've never been able to find what exact ritual that they used, but it's believed to have been one of the common ones that were available to them at that time in French in nature. Not long after the creation of this lodge, trouble started happening in New Orleans. The French were very tolerant of Freemasonry, but there was a war going on between France and England, and this war was not going well for France. And by the early 1760s, they realized it wasn't going to go their way at all, and they wanted to do something about the whole Louisiana territory. The fear was that Great Britain was going to take it over and England would take over that area, and that wouldn't please anyone really. So what they did was they made a deal with Spain, and the idea was to turn the whole Louisiana territory over to Spain, and with the agreement that there would be a period of time when France would get it back. But during that time that Spain controlled it, they could keep all the profits that came from the shipping and transportation and such. So that deal was agreeable to Spain, and they made it. Problem was, the people of New Orleans, the citizens there, they considered themselves French, but they had always had a difficult relationship with France. They felt like they were more or less stepchildren. And when this trade took over and they turned the area over to Spain, the citizens of New Orleans felt betrayed. And when Spain came in, it more or less came down with a sledgehammer, especially in areas such as Freemasonry, where it had been really tolerated and no problem at all with the French. It was outlawed by Spain. Citizens of New Orleans ended up revolting, and they attacked and were crushed. And the Masons who were taking part in this, the worshipful master of that lodge, the Spanish soldiers came to his house in the French Quarter, broke it in, and bayoneted him to death. A number of the other Masonic leaders were captured and sent to prison. So what happened to Freemasonry from the period following the 1760s, we're not exactly sure, because all records are not available for that later period. And what we believe is that either Freemasonry died off or it went underground. And later on, even after the creation of the Grand Lodge in 1812, there was records and hints suggesting that there was an earlier Masonry, or there were unaffiliated lodges existing in the city. And it's a clouded area. What we do know is that towards the end of the term of the Spanish control, 2 lodges were created in New Orleans, and these 2 lodges still exist today. That was Perfect Union #1 and Etoile Polea #1. And I can explain why both of them have the carry #1 in a little bit. But these 2 lodges were created in New Orleans, but they were outside the city limits, outside of the confines of the French Quarter itself. And this was done so that it wouldn't, I guess, be in the face of the Spanish as much. So they were left alone. And by 1803, everything began changing again, and it switched over to France, and it immediately went to the United States, and we had the entire Louisiana territory. Louisiana, the Masonry in New Orleans began to flourish at this time. Again, it was French in nature, and the French language was used in New Orleans well until the mid-1800s. In fact, when Albert Pike came to New Orleans to practice law, before he was allowed to practice law, he had to pass a test to prove that he could read and write in the French language in order to get his law license there, because all the documents were in French. But the Masonry in New Orleans, just prior to the creation of the Grand Lodge, was flourishing, and there was a lot of activity, and it had numerous jurisdictions. And the catch was, it was all in the French language. And when the Grand Lodge was created, it was created by 5 French-speaking lodges. And if you take the New Orleans area and separate it, in 1812, the Grand Lodge was created. That was the same year Louisiana became a state. However, it was very different than Masonry outside Louisiana. And the reason was, following the American Revolution, uh, the provincial Grand Lodges, England, Ireland, Scotland, all of these, everything was severed, and United States became United States Masonry. The Masonry here was cut away, and we had to define ourselves. And there was a lot of talk of how we could do this, what we could do, and there was talk of one Grand Lodge for the entire country, one Grand Master. Um, they realized maybe we ought to go with the concept that government is following with states' rights. And they decided on having one Grand Lodge per state. And they began to fine tune that concept. And it became one Grand Lodge per state, one ritual per state, and one language per state. And that was English. And they felt that by having everything common, it would be a benefit to all. And they were wrinkled areas, such as South Carolina, which had two Grand Lodges, and both of them were considered perfectly regular, but they wanted one Grand Lodge. And so there was a lot of pressure on South Carolina. And I personally believe that while the records don't exist from the very early Charleston Supreme Council, I believe that there was every original desire to work in the craft degrees as well as from the fourth onward. And the reason that they didn't was because of the problems of already having two Grand Lodges, and the idea of a third body in that state controlling craft would have been unthinkable. And so that went by the wayside. But the two Grand Lodges ended up merging into one after a period of trouble. But it was this concept that they had, that they wanted the Masonry to be alike, and that if there was any difference, like South Carolina having two Grand Lodges, that was considered unacceptable. Well, Louisiana began to present a problem because that trade route coming down the Mississippi, bringing goods out to the Gulf of Mexico and onward, brought with them a lot of Masons who would come down, traveling down, and they'd come into New Orleans and they'd go visit different lodges. And when they'd visit these lodges, it was nothing at all like they expected. Not too many years after the creation of the Grand Lodge of Louisiana, lodges in the New Orleans area were working in 5 different languages. You had French, you had English, you had Italian, you had German, you had Spanish. And they were working in at least 3 different rituals that we're sure of. That would be the Scottish Rite Craft Lodge ritual, the York Rite Craft Lodge ritual, and the French or Modern Rite Craft Lodge ritual. Most likely, in the very early days, and this goes for the Grand Lodge as well, they very well may have worked in the old Order of the Royal Secret. The Craft Lodge rituals evolved with that. We have the Bonsignor rituals that were discovered. I found them in the 90s in Tulane University, and it looks like it would have been the exact time and the type of ritual that would have been perfectly acceptable to lodges during that time. And the fact that we have no information that can definitively say this lodge worked this ritual, this lodge worked that ritual, the best that we can do is look at what was available at the time and what probably would have been used by these lodges. And the Grand Lodge itself could have used this ritual in the very early days. It's just not clear. But these visitors were coming down to the early Grand Lodge, the lodges, complained to the Grand Lodge that, this is not what we're seeing here, is not what we're used to seeing elsewhere. It's different, and that can't be good. Now, the Grand Lodge at that time, in the very early days of Louisiana Masonry, it was more of a European style uh, leadership. But when I say that, I mean they were more or less hands off of the local lodges. And unless there was some reason to become involved in something, they were there for the big picture, fraternal relations outside, making sure the yearly returns came in, or any big problems. But they didn't normally get involved in the day-to-day life of a lodge and things like ritual. As long as the lodge was working a ritual that was accepted somewhere, then that was okay. And the language was up to the members of the lodge. If they wanted to work in this or that language, and that was the language that they spoke, why not? So that was the position that the Grand Lodge had taken. And so with the complaints that were coming in about that Louisiana Masonry was different than other places, we're trying to accommodate everyone. That was the general answer. So, you know, if you don't like the language or the particular ritual, and you do have a language like, and you do have a create your own lodge. And that's what started to happen. They started developing their own lodges. Over a period of time, this agitation over the rituals grew. And by the early uh, 1830s, there was several lodges that were really antagonistic towards each other and then ended up disliking each other intensely. There was one York Rite English speaking lodge and one French speaking French and Modern Rite lodge that the hostility between the two bodies grew so great that by lodge resolution, they broke fraternal relations with each other. Well, the Grand Lodge had to step in and they said, you know, you can't break relations with each other. You're both lodges under our jurisdictions. We establish fraternal relations. And they tried to settle that over, but they realized that they had to do something in order to try to settle this problem about the rituals. So what they did was they got together a committee and they discussed it and they ended up forming another committee with 3 subcommittees, and they called it the Chamber of Rites. And this committee or group of committees, one group would control and supervise the York Rite ritual, one the Scottish Rite, and one the French or Modern Rite. Well, the Grand Lodge looked at it and they were very pleased. They said, well, this will accommodate, we'll have supervision for the 3 rituals, make it clear which lodges work which ritual, and this should solve the problem. Well, instead of solving the problem, the English-speaking York Rite Masons, they went crazy. They said, no, this does not solve the problem at all. This makes the problem worse. Grand Lodge basically said, well, what do you want? What is it that you want? And I said, we told you we want one ritual, one language. Grand Lodge says that's unreasonable. We can't do that. We have people that have spoken French since the time they were born. They don't speak English. That's their problem. So met with this, the Grand Lodge simply said, no, the way we're doing this is the way we're going to do this. We're trying to accommodate as many people as we can, different languages, different preferences. There is no problem here. This is all Masonry. This is what we're going with. And the anger and the frustration, when I started doing Masonic research, much of the early Louisiana Masonry was lost and missing. I went to countless numbers of libraries, research centers, not only in New Orleans, but outside New Orleans, outside in Louisiana and outside Louisiana, anywhere I could go to find material. And as I was going through this, I started seeing the outright anger that was starting to develop between the two sides. And I would feel sick to my stomach when I would read some of the exchanges that were taking place. It was no longer, I'm right and you're wrong. It became, I'm good and you're evil, and I'm going to do whatever it takes to destroy you. And this was the attitude between Masons towards other Masons. And I couldn't understand it. They're both in the same jurisdiction. So I started researching more and more. And what ended up happening, um, the circumstances in New Orleans was that the trade coming down the Mississippi River was making the city of New Orleans grow in size. And the French population of the city was once very much in the majority, but that was reducing. And more English speaking Masons were coming in, and they were starting to be, while they were still a minority, they were a strong minority. And an interesting situation developed in that there was pressure, and the French speaking Masons, while they outnumbered the English speaking Masons, the French speaking Masons were divided. And they were divided along the lines of Scottish Rite and French or modern Rite. And if you go deeper, it was cultural differences in the French and the Creoles. The Creoles were New Orleans born, French speaking, uh, France or somewhere outside of New Orleans, and they were distinct cultural differences that they had. But in any event, they split. So with the French speaking factions divided, the English outnumbered the French, and they were able to drive a wedge. And by 1847, they petitioned the Grand Lodge of Mississippi to declare the Grand Lodge of Louisiana irregular. Well, it did so, and there's a lot of reasons behind that. There was a lot of Scottish Rite maneuvering going on at the time, and that's for another story. We'd go on for 3 days if we did. But it would, they declared Louisiana irregular, and the Grand Lodge of Mississippi chartered 7 lodges in the city of New Orleans. And these 7 lodges organized themselves into a Grand Lodge, which was the Grand Lodge of York Rite Masons of the Grand Lodge of Louisiana. And so these 2 bodies, you would think there wouldn't be much of a battle. The only Grand Lodge that recognized this newly created body was the Grand Lodge of Mississippi. The balance of the U.S. Grand Lodges either openly condemned it or didn't really want to interfere with it because they didn't particularly care for the multiple languages or multiple rituals either. But the problem was this division within the French-speaking Masons and the mean-spirited and introducing information that was absolutely false, but believed by people who didn't know any better. And the majority of the Masons who were rank and file and who simply went to lodge, they didn't know what was right, what was wrong, it was all things that were happening around them, but they didn't really understand much of what happened. And the result was the Grand Lodge of Louisiana realized by late 1849 that they probably couldn't survive. And so they entered into negotiations with the Louisiana York Rite Grand Lodge, and they merged in 1850. Well, this merger was actually more of a takeover, and the English-speaking faction basically took over the Grand Lodge. All the Grand Lodge offices were from the former irregular Grand Lodge, and they completely changed everything. All the non-York Rite Masons lodges were told to turn in their charters, and they would go reverse everything to York Rite English-speaking masonry. Well, the Scottish Rite lodges, the French lodges, they went crazy, and 3 of them pulled out as a result of it, and they went to the jurisdiction. They sought relief from the Supreme Council of Louisiana. Now, the Supreme Council of Louisiana was created in 1839, and it adhered to an agreement that was made by the Grand Consistory of Louisiana, which was created in 1811, and that was that the Grand Lodge would charter would be the only body that would charter craft Rite lodges. And the agreement was that the Grand Lodge would always provide for Scottish Rite lodges. And with that, the Grand Consistory says, okay, we will begin our work on the fourth degree and go onward. And then when they passed under the jurisdiction of the Supreme Council honored that agreement and said, okay, we will work from the fourth degree onward, just like the Charleston Council did. But when the new Grand Lodge of Louisiana kicked out all the Scottish Rite lodges and said, you're not going to work in this ritual any longer, three of these lodges petitioned the Supreme Council, said, we're not allowed to continue to work. This agreement that was created in 1833, I think it was, it's no longer valid. Can we pass under your jurisdiction? The Supreme Council said yes. And so they took them in. And that's when the Supreme Council of Louisiana began working in the craft lodge ritual. And the division that had happened and the anger was not settled by this. It only became worse. And it was ready to explode in who knows what. And it was an event that happened that changed everything, that no one could have predicted and no one thought could happen. And what it was in 1849, there was a, 1854, it was 1854, there was a Spanish fever epidemic in New Orleans. And just like that, the Grand Lodge, the new Grand Lodge of Louisiana, lost all of its line officers and the Grand Treasurer and Secretary to yellow fever. They all were dead. Well, the Grand Lodge of Louisiana is now in turmoil because it has all of its leaders were wiped out. So what happened was a senior past Grand Master, and if there's any Texas Masons online, you'll probably recognize the name. It was John Holland. He has served more times as Grand Master than any Grand Master in Louisiana history. It was 12 times, I think it was. But he stood up and with questionable authority, he dropped the gavel. He says, okay, I'm taking charge. He says, we have a serious situation, and they called for an election. And all the past Grand Masters got together and they said, okay, we're going to get the lodges that can come. We want everything here. And they revised a lot of the situation and the severity that had existed with the Louisiana Grand Lodge faction was softened dramatically. And there was a lot of concessions that were made, and they sat down at the table and they negotiated, and neither side got exactly what they wanted, but they were able to continue and they were able to bridge a lot of the gaps. And this continued. And it's how eventually today we have the 16th Masonic District, which is exclusively Scottish Rite craft lodges. And I'm amazed. I know when I first joined Masonry, I learned right away that there were two types of lodges, Scottish Rite and York Rite lodges, but I had no idea why they existed or what they were or anything. And I thought that this was the way it was everywhere. I was amazed when I learned that Louisiana was unique in this. And I've often wondered if sometimes we're our own worst enemy by, I've had some jurisdictions, I had one jurisdiction invite me to speak and then uninvite me when they realized the subject was Scottish Rite craft lodges, because they thought that I was going to make Scottish Rite Masons at sight. And I says, one individual did. I said, Louisiana doesn't do that. I said, it's not possible. I said, I certainly couldn't do that. And I said, but there's an interesting view of the Scottish Rite craft Masonry. And those who witness the degrees and see them realize the beauty and the philosophy. And what I've tried to do over these last 40 some odd years is to try and show that there's more to Masonry than just attending a meeting and doing a little ritual and think that this is the only way it can be possibly done. The fact is, even in the craft lodge ritual that's worked by majority of the U.S. jurisdictions, there's variations between one jurisdiction and another jurisdiction. A valid initiation requires certain elements to be present, but it doesn't require that certain ritualistic words have to be exactly the same. There can be variances as long as certain points are there. And this is how you judge a valid ritual from a ritual that's meaningless. And there are many Masonic rites with craft lodge rituals that are beautiful and meaningful and not damaging to anything. And all that I've tried to do is try to show that we need to be one. And Freemasonry, I know, has been suffering problems since I've been a Mason. And we just need to work together and try to grow and try to turn things, in my opinion, from a club atmosphere to something that's deeper and more meaningful. Uh, I am, uh, I guess, big in the sense that when I first joined and took the Scottish Rite degrees, I knew I was coming home. That's how much this impressed me. And the Scottish Rite craft rituals lead to everything else that you experience in the Scottish Rite degrees. And I think it's a vitally important part for any Scottish Rite Mason to at least know what this is. And so this is what I've been trying to do this time. And my goal has always been to try and get us to come together in a way, not to judge each other by difference equals bad. Difference may not always be bad. Sometimes different can be horrible, but sometimes differences can be great. And sometimes by trying to step out from a comfort zone and to see something that's a little different might bring something inside you touching us, and it can be a benefit that we may not have realized. So that concludes my talk. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I don't know if you want to ask any questions or where we go from here, or if we're having technical problems, not sure.
Brother Paul, we have a couple of questions already, and I
Glad.
invite everyone else, if you have any questions, to raise your hand in the Zoom meeting, or if you're watching on Facebook Live, you can submit a question there as a comment. And we had a question from Roger Calendine. Roger, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
What are the difference? Good afternoon, Roger Calendine here. I guess it's really morning here. What is the difference between Ohio Scottish Rite, which is in the North Masonic jurisdiction out of Boston, and what you've described so far?
Well, the northern jurisdiction has different rituals than the southern jurisdiction. But if you're talking about from the 4th to the 33rd degree, it's two different supreme councils, and the northern jurisdiction has rituals that are a little bit different than the southern jurisdiction. As far as what I've been speaking of, this is the craft lodge degrees, and this is something that's controlled by the Grand Lodge. The Grand Lodge of Louisiana has 10 Scottish Rite craft lodges, and I guess I should really point this out right now. Every now and then I've had individuals tell me that they visited New Orleans and they had a chance to visit one of the Scottish Rite craft lodges, and they saw our degree, and they said, "This is beautiful. I want to get this in my jurisdiction." And they said, "I've spoken to my SGIG, and he's all for it." And I said, "No, that's not the way this goes." I said, "You could get your SGIG in trouble." I said, "What you have to do is go to your Grand Lodge." I said, "This is something that's under the Grand Lodge of Louisiana." And I said, "The Southern jurisdiction does not control craft degrees. The Northern jurisdiction does not control craft degrees." I said, "You want to start to your Grand Lodge." I said, "The only way this would work is if all the Grand Lodges got together and said, okay, we have no problem with a Supreme Council controlling Scottish Rite craft degrees." I said, the Southern jurisdiction or any Supreme Council that controls degrees would have no problem. I said, "But we've had this situation since the early days of the Grand Lodge that Grand Lodges in the US control degrees, and they define what they want as far as ritual. And if the Scottish Rite Craft Lodge ritual was desired by Masons within a jurisdiction, then they have to follow whatever procedure they use for their Grand Lodge to introduce a new ritual, if it could be even done, if it would be entertained, if that makes any sense."
Okay. Thank you, Brother Paul. We also have Brother Paul Soto, and he's asked some questions in the Q&A there. Let's go with, what is the purpose of ritual? What exactly is each Mason taking away from them to the greater public?
I can't answer what's in somebody else's heart and what they take away. I can only tell you that a ritual is a vehicle that can be used for initiation as elements that are necessary for an initiation. And the ritual is kind of like you jump in a car to get to a destination. It can provide a way there. Doesn't necessarily mean it will, but it can. But I certainly can't get into anyone else's mind or heart and tell you what their initiation meant to them, if I'm understanding the question correctly.
Okay. Brother Soto has actually, I have a question from Brother Larry Long. According to the 1786 Constitution, does a Grand Lodge receive its charter to form a Grand Lodge from a Supreme Council?
Wait, according to the Grand Constitutions of 1786, does a Grand Lodge, well, if you hold that the Grand Constitutions of 1786 are correct, then a Supreme Council system didn't start until 1786. I hold that they began in 1801, but they were Grand Lodges prior to 1786. So how could a Grand Lodge be required to receive a charter from a body that doesn't exist yet? No, I don't believe that. I believe the Grand Constitutions of 1786, whoever wrote them, whoever approved them, set up a very good system for the creation and operation of a Supreme Council of the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite, which is a different animal than a Grand Lodge, my opinion.
Okay, I'm going to let Brother Mr. Soto ask his other question here.
Hi, good morning. Conversation within San Jose history right now. Thomas Fallon, who was a brother of Masonic Lodge 10 that was established here in San Jose, California, in 1845. Okay, what Thomas Fallon did is he staked the American flag here in San Jose, California, where I'm from, in July 14th, 1846. This was at the nascent of the Mexican-American War. Okay. And he did this at the behest of James Polk. Of course, it went tentacle through all of these different sergeants and, captains and officers. But ultimately, because it was the American flag, this is the behest of James Polk. So the concepts of manifest destiny were inserted into this area of San Jose via Masonry, Scottish Rite Masonry. We have a Masonic temple literally right across the street from the town's center, a park, St. James Park, in the center of our city. There is a large Masonic temple. And people like, oh, well, that's an Egyptian. People thought it was an Egyptian museum. And so during my research, and it just recently came out, the Thomas Fallon statue, I was on one of the committees to get it removed. Okay, because I understood what manifest destiny does, what its concepts and what its values, what values it embodies. Okay, and so what my question is, how is anything that the Scottish Rite rituals, how is anything there consistent with what manifest destiny actually did if it is inserted into a community via a 33rd degree Mason, James Polk? And that goes along with Peter Burnett, Leland Stanford, and Thomas Fallon. And it's Masonic Lodge 10 in San Jose. That's my question. How is it consistent, what Manifest Destiny did to populations with Scottish Rite Masonry? Thank you.
Welcome. What I'm going to give you is opinion, because I certainly don't speak for any Masonic body. But I believe that if I'm given instructions on how to build a table, and I take those instructions and I build a chair, that's not a problem with the instructions. That's a problem with me to start with. And I believe very strongly that the philosophy of Freemasonry, as well as the philosophy of the Scottish Rite, is a pure philosophy. I do not believe that these philosophies can be in any way damaged by anyone or any person or anything. But I believe when they're put into actions, that human beings are the problem. I believe that Masonry is having problems today, and it has had problems for many years. But it's not the philosophy that's the problem. It's the individual who, through misinterpretation of what he believes or ego or any of these elements, that take something that's good and bend it a little bit, and then you start having problems. Do you see what I mean? Does that make any sense?
Yes, but no. And no, in the sense that the Masonic temple was established. I mean, this is a large, large temple. It has all your 6 precepts. It has your 6 pillars. Mm-hmm. It has it has the all-seeing eye on doors. It's engraved. It is a very, very ornate building. Mm-hmm. Okay, and the reason how I connected this piece is that a brother, one of his brothers, we had a public meeting with regard to the removal of the statue and all that it represented, because that's what was inserted, the philosophy of manifest destiny via the Masons in San Jose. I'm a Mexican. I'm also a California Mission Indian, a registered. So I'm very versed in my history, in California history. And so the one piece that was missing, though, was the brother participated in the meeting, and he stated, he is one of us. He is kin. He was initiated into the Scottish Rite Masonry, Masonic Lodge number 10, which is that temple that's right across the street in my city center that I passed by every day as a little boy. So once he said that, it made all the sense in the world. It connected everything. See, because Peter Burnett and Leland Stanford were also co-authors of the Chinese Exclusionary Act. Mm-hmm. So you have this. So what I'm saying is that there's no way really to extricate the philosophical insertion, not philosophically independent of their behavior. That I agree with you. I think Masonry is beautiful. Beautiful in the sense that it sees the human body in the human form through ritual to create that connection to the spiritual realms. Okay, so that I understand that, and I've read Manly P. Hall's Secret Teachings of the Ages. I mean, I don't just like read it. That's like a manual. I have that next to my Bible because I don't see any inconsistency between the philosophical convictions that Manly P. Hall outlined and the Bible. I don't see any inconsistency. However, from the governmental sense and the administration of government in this country, yes, there's conflict. And that goes to the core of my question to you. How is it that it's consistent? Because George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Voltaire, Benjamin Franklin, Paul Revere, all of these people, you can't separate their Masonic connections and the institution of this government. There's no way to do that. So that's why that's the root of my question is how is it that it's consistent? Because you can't separate, okay, well, the philosophy is one thing, but the people that practiced it are different. No, because they were doing it at the behest of Masonry. And that's outlined in George Washington's wearing the apron and the ritual of setting the cornerstone. These were all Masonic rituals. So that's what I mean in the sense that you can't separate the two.
Okay. Let me point out a couple of things. First, I know zero about the events or the place that you're talking about. I don't know anything about that. However, about a year or two ago, I saw a photograph of a Masonic lodge in Haiti. And it was set up where they had folding chairs, and I mean beaten up old folding chairs. And it had what looked like vegetable carts turned over for the warden's chairs in the master station. And the members who were walking around were wearing, the clothes looked clean, but you could see holes in some of them. They were old. This was a poor group of men. But there was a look in their eyes. There was a pride that what they were doing was something very, very significant. The problem is Masonic lodges there's Masonry, and then there's Masons, individual Masons who do something wrong. And for that, we have trial. I don't know where you're going with this, to be honest. I don't know the situation, and I'm not exactly clear on what you're asking and what you're saying. It seems like you're tying an event to the whole of Masonry, and I'm not sure I'm the best one to answer this because it has nothing to do with Louisiana Masonry. What it has to do with the Scottish Rite, I'm still unclear on where you're going with it. So I wish you good searches, but I don't know that I can answer any more than what I've already answered.
Okay, thank you. We have some more questions, Brother Paul. We have one from Facebook. What major differences, if any, are there between strict observance and the Scottish Rite craft degrees?
There's differences. I can't get into exact differences, but each Masonic Rite has a unique, a Masonic Rite is classified by, it begins in the end of an apprentice degree and it ends in whatever degree it ends in. They all vary somewhat. The Scottish Rite craft degrees, each system has its own little peculiarities, and yet they follow a basic common core. So I can't get into actual ritual here, but there's differences between each Masonic Rite, and the strict observance is not the Scottish Rite. Let me just put it like that. It's two different systems. It's like the Memphis Rite. You could say, well, it's philosophical too, but it's not the Scottish Rite. It's a different system.
Okay.
If that answers.
Yes, we have a question from Larry Long. Is the circular of two hemispheres in the circular of two hemispheres, it names the prince of the royal secret at the 30th and 31st grades, and the 32nd as Prince of Masons. Do you know why they changed that?
No, but I know that the Prince of the Royal Secret was changed. You see, in 1855 was a concordat between the Southern jurisdiction and the Supreme and half of the Supreme Council of Louisiana. And prior to that, there's a lot of debate as to what degrees. You could see other inconsistencies in that list of degrees. The Prince of Mercy degree was in a different place. From what I can tell, the early Charleston Council had a system. Guy who was helping them, Alexander de Grasse-Tilly, he left, and 1802 he created a Supreme Council in the Leeward Islands. Early 1804 he created the lodge in Kingston, Jamaica, and from that Supreme Council came several of his SGIGs created the first Scottish Rite Craft Lodge, a 33-degree system in New Orleans in 1807. And then he went to France in late 1804, created a Supreme Council of France. But these three Supreme Councils all worked the complete system from an EA degree to 33rd. And if you look at I found the lost minutes of the Grand Consistory of Louisiana some years back, and it doesn't go to the beginning, but it goes to 1822. And if you look at the degree structure that's given, it matches the degree structure of the Southern jurisdiction today. So I'm led to believe that at some point they made changes in these degrees. Now, the 32nd degree and the presiding officer of a Grand Consistory in the Southern jurisdiction changed post 1855 by Albert Pike, because what happened is the Grand Consistory of Louisiana split in two. The Supreme Council of Louisiana continued to exist, and they had their half of the Grand Consistory of Louisiana. And I have a letter that Albert Pike wrote to James Batchelor, and he was chewing him out because 33rds from the Grand Consistory of Louisiana, who were former 33rds under the Supreme Council of Louisiana, as well as new 33rds under the Grand Consistory, who this was now under the Charleston Southern jurisdiction, they were going over and visiting Supreme Council sessions at the Supreme Council of Louisiana. And he says, you can't do that. That's a different Supreme Council. And he was concerned that there was confusion. So he changed it from Prince of the Royal Secret to Master of the Royal Secret. And he changed the presiding officer of the Grand Consistory from Commander-in-Chief to Grand Master of Kadash. So simply you could tell them apart. You tell right away, what degree are you? 32nd, what's the name of that degree? If you said Master of the Royal Secret, okay, you're Southern jurisdiction. If you said Prince, they said, you with them. And the interesting thing is I have pretty reliable information that the Valley of New Orleans, the Grand Consistory of Louisiana, and the Grand Consistory of Louisiana under the Supreme Council of Louisiana, they used to help each out with degrees all the way into the 1920s, 1930s. So I don't know, but the degree names that changed were because Pike wanted to differentiate between the two bodies so that you could tell them apart quickly, if that helps.
Okay, Brother Paul, we have another question about the Louisiana 16th district. I assume you probably get lots of these questions, but he asked, how many Scottish Rite rituals are being practiced in the Louisiana 16th district currently?
Well, yeah, that's an interesting question, because you see, Grand Lodge of Louisiana had 3 rituals that they approved, and they when 1850 came, they said they wanted York Rite lodges, and then everything blew up, and they ended up relenting, and so you had some Scottish Rite was left. The odd man out was the French Rite, and so you say, what happened to the French Rite in Louis? Not can't really say as far as the Grand Lodge, but the Grand Lodge of Louisiana's early position was the hands off, and because of that, some of the lodges, their rituals were unique. The first book I published was it wasn't released publicly. It was it was a consignment job for one of the 16th District lodges. It was Germania Lodge number 46. And it was translating the German ritual into English, because that was the original. They worked for the first 100 years in German. So there was a young Texas Mason that I knew, that I had met through some people, and we used to write back and forth from Texas. It was Otto Hoyos, and well, he translated the ritual, and we published the book. And when it was translated, we were surprised, because whoever sat down and did the original German translation must have had the rituals in front of him for the York Rite, the Scottish Rite, and the French Rite, because they took elements. It was an eclectic ritual. They took elements of it. And it was the same thing with Cervantes Lodge. That was a Spanish-speaking lodge. They had elements in it that would, and the problem was that the Grand Lodge of Louisiana post 1850 or 1855, they disbanded the Chamber of Rites, which was the 3, and they adopted the one ritual, the York Rite. And while they allowed the Scottish Rite, there was no supervision of the Scottish Rite ritual. And the problem came because there was a feeling that, well, we won because the Grand Lodge isn't supervising our ritual. That's not the case. The Grand Lodge didn't want to supervise it. And the result was, over time, just like in different Grand Lodges, these 10 lodges were like 10 mini Grand Lodges as far as ritual, and they all began to diverge a little bit, especially the older lodges. And one of, especially when you had 5 different languages, and eventually all of them switched over to English, the translation problems, translation differences. One will say this, the other will say this. And they're not major. The key elements in all 10 lodges are the same, but there's other variances. And in some of the variances, you can clearly see the influence of the old French Rite. So we say, well, this lodge maybe had some influence. Maybe it was French Rite. And so it's hard to say there's one recommended ritual by the Grand Lodge for the Scottish Rite, but it's their own version that they've come. And some of the newer lodges use that. The older lodges usually say, thank you, we have our own ritual. And the district grand lecturer in every jurisdiction except the 16th ritual has complete authority over that ritual in their jurisdiction. And their job is to make sure that all the ritual is the same, and they can stop a degree if it's being done improperly. The 16th district grand lecturer doesn't have that. He say, well, I'd like you to do it this way, and the result is that we have variances. So it's hard to say how many, because they each have their own variances and they will not tolerate interference in the ritual, if that answers.
Michael, this is Bob Davis. I very much have appreciated your comments today. I got a lot out of it. I'm curious if another Scottish Rite Craft Lodge wanted to get chartered in Louisiana. Is that possible legally today?
In Louisiana? Yes.
Yeah.
That changed a few years ago. There was the Grand Lodge had made a ruling, wow, late 1800s, that there could only be 10 lodges. And if there is any lodge of those 10 that died or ceased to exist, that's it. You lose it and you become 9 or you become 8. But that no new Scottish Rite Craft Lodges could be created. That changed about 8-10 years ago. I don't remember. And the ruling was that the Grand Lodge said that they could have one more additional lodge in each of the Scottish Rite jurisdictions in Louisiana. And there's 5 valleys. And you could have one Scottish Rite Lodge in an area. And when they did that, I had a real problem with it, simply because the Scottish Rite ritual is very different. And I said, well, who's going to be the district grand lecturer if you have a Scottish Rite Lodge that opens up in Shreveport? Who's going to teach the ritual there? And you couldn't have a guy from New Orleans running back and forth. So they did this, but no Scottish Rite Lodge additional lodge has been created since then, simply because they've got to get the educational part down, and they have to understand they have to have enough experience coming to New Orleans to see the Scottish Rite rituals and to be able to proficiently do it before it'll really be allowed to open.
Thank you. Are there still traveling degree teams and one of those 10 or more of those 10? And so we could have a degree team come into Oklahoma, and just as Masonic education,
Yes.
They could confer their degrees. And
let me stop. Yes, but I don't know about right now because everything's shut down with that. I think it's probably next year or so. But yes, they do have a 16th district degree team. And it went to the southern jurisdiction. Brent Morris was made an honorary Mason. He was the candidate for one of the degrees at the House of the Temple. They did that a few years ago. But yes, the first one that I remember them doing, I participated in. We went to Denver, and it was Denver Lodge number 5, and we went there and we conferred a Scottish Rite, an exemplification. And we've had places that were scared that they didn't want to do it because they thought we'd actually make somebody. And no, that's not the case at all. But yes, they have been doing that for a number of years, and as possible, they're very willing to do it.
And one other question, Larry Long asked the question: could 3 Scottish Rite lodges in Louisiana organize another Grand Lodge? And I'm assuming the answer to that would be definitely not, just because of the American doctrine of exclusive jurisdictions. Even the Grand Lodge of Louisiana would not allow or would not recognize a separately chartered Grand Lodge, would it?
Well, you see, I got in a lot of trouble in 1990 or 89, whatever it was, because somebody asked me, does the Grand Lodge of Connecticut have the right to recognize another Grand Lodge within their state, the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Connecticut? And I said, the Grand Lodge has the right to do whatever it wants to do. If other Grand Lodges don't like that, then other Grand Lodges can step in and do something. but a Grand Lodge has the right to do whatever it wants. Now, if the 10 lodges in the 16th district wanted to do this and wanted to create a Scottish Rite Grand Lodge, they could do it. Whether or not they would be recognized as regular is a different story, but they could do it. We had a group of Masons in Baton Rouge who decided that they were unhappy some 10, 15 years ago, and they created their own Grand Lodge. They created a lodge on their own. They were not recognized by anyone, but we don't say they can't do it, but whether or not they'd be recognized is a whole different story, if you see what I mean.
Yeah. Yes, I understand. Thank you.
And actually, to be honest, I'm not so sure that if it was done in a way that was in collaboration with the Grand Lodge, that it would be deemed irregular. If they worked with the Grand, if they just went on their own and said, I'm going to do what I want. But if they worked with the Grand Lodge, I can't say. I really can't say that. And I don't want to say definitely no, because I can't answer.
Sure. Well, it's just like a Grand Lodge, you know, can recognize a Prince Hall Grand Lodge in a jurisdiction, and it would be no different. You know, as far as jurisprudence, a Grand Lodge could recognize another Grand Lodge in the same geographic area. You know, so I can understand how in theory it would work, but it would have to be, there would have to be a joint reason why it should exist that all could agree with, I think.
Everyone would have to agree. Everyone would have to work together and say, what's the reason? Why do we want to do this? Is this important? And one of my personal opinion is that when we created Masonry in the United States, we got off to the wrong foot, because a Masonic rite is a complete system. And we work two Masonic rites primarily in the United States, the York Rite and the Scottish Rite. Each of them have a craft lodge and an apprentice degree with a unique ritual. And I believe the Scottish Rite was relegated to an appendant body when it's not really an appendant body. And we work it customarily through a Grand Lodge system, but that's our choice. If the Southern jurisdiction at some point, they still have the De La Mata Rejoinder, which says that if ever there was an actual need, we could do it. And that's what actually Louisiana used back in 1855. They used the Southern jurisdiction's own paper to say, well, we got 3 lodges that are being told that they're being shut down because they're not allowed to exist. What do we do? These lodges have been around for a long time. Okay, we're going to use this rejoinder, and this is what we could do. So it's an interesting discussion, and it's above my pay grade, if I can answer that.
I understand.
Okay, thank you for lots of great questions, and worshipful Brother Paul, it's been a true pleasure to have you with us. I don't know if you recall that far back, but almost 3 years ago, you and I made some early internet virtual education possible at Duncan Lodge number 60, where I was a worshipful master, and we were doing Skype presentations way back before we had to, and it really pleased that you're with us again.
Well, I remember CompuServe, so
yeah.
I do want to share a little bit about next month's meeting. It will be the same first Saturday, 10 a.m. But I don't have a I don't have the liberty to tell you who the speaker is yet or what the topic is. It's a secret, and I can tell you that it will be regarding new research that is forthcoming in a soon-to-be published book by this brother, and you won't want to miss it. And you do need to register for the Zoom webinar, because the agreement I've made with this presenter is that it will not be streamed live on Facebook or YouTube. It will not be recorded for later viewing. So if you want to be in the know, watch your email. In the next few days, we'll have registration sent out to members of the Oklahoma Lodge of Research first, and then we'll open it up to others. But I think we're going to have a nice turnout for that, and but I can't tell you who it is yet. Just that it won't be recorded, and you don't want to miss it. And with that, I'll ask Most Worshipful Davis, do you have anything to add as we go on about our business?
Well, no, except that I very much appreciate the Oklahoma Lodge of Research providing this monthly education series. And I've tried to attend every one that you've had so far, and certainly have not been disappointed. And so keep up the good work there. And Brother Michael, it's such a delight to see you. Michael Pohl and I used to help the International Philately Society register people at the All Masonic Week, and that was more years ago than either one of us care to remember, probably. But
120.
Yeah. And and Michael has always been one of the few brothers whose research has focused on the uniqueness of Louisiana Freemasonry. And so he's widely recognized as the scholar when it relates to the Scottish Rite and its relationship to Grand Lodge in Louisiana. So Michael, very much enjoyed your presentation. Thank you for agreeing to take your morning and help the Lodge research.
Very welcome.
Okay. Thank you all again for attending, and we'll see you next month.